and welcome to this Institution of Mechanical Engineers webinar on the challenges and complexities of data utilization and waste management in the distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. My name is Dr. Tim Fox, and I'm chair of the IMechE Process Industries Division, who are hosting today's event. And this webinar is the second in a series of 3 being organized by our Pharmaceutical Committee, one of the 6 technical advisory committees of the board. It gives me great pleasure to introduce a superb lineup of really excellent speakers for today's discussion. You can find all their biographies on the web page that you use to access the registration process for today's event, and I'd encourage you to take a look at that while the event is in play. First, we'll hear from Filippo Del Masso, lead serialization and vaccines traceability at GlaxoSmithKline. Filippo will talk for about 6 to 7 minutes on some of the data utilization related challenges. Filippo is well positioned to talk to us about this as an electrical engineer with 32 years international experience in chemical and pharmaceutical industries. And since 2014, he's been leading the global serialization and vaccines traceability program at GSK Vaccines. Next will be Professor Toby Peters. Toby is an award-winning technology developer and an industrial academic. He's certainly the world's leading expert and thinker on all aspects of sustainable cooling. And in fact, Toby was the originator of the very concept of clean cooling and architect of the cold economy. He's now a professor of cold economy at the University of Birmingham, which is in fact the world's first chair in that topic. Toby will be spending some time introducing issues associated with waste management and data utilization in the cold chain, and touching on some of the broader issues of equitability and sustainability in the distribution of COVID vaccines. Toby will then lead a conversation with our panel of conversation guests this afternoon to discuss many of the topics raised during the presentations and in response to a number of thoughts generated by recent developments in the distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. And in that conversation, he will be chatting with Amy Shortman, Director of Product Marketing at Overall Group Incorporated. Amy is a chartered fellow of the Institute of Transport and Logistics and has over 20 years experience within the pharmaceutical logistics industry. During that time, she's worked within operations and commercial roles and is passionate about creating supply chains that ensure product integrity is maintained throughout. After Amy, we have Errol Rodell, who is CEO of IMechE AG, and he is a Swiss-German-Thai citizen, so has a unique perspective on the sort of challenges we've been facing with the distribution of the vaccine. And he's currently based in the United Kingdom. Errol heads up IMechE AG, a digital authentication solutions provider based in Switzerland, and is the initiator and program manager of an international consortium of experts and multinational corporations aiming to serve developing countries with integrity turnkey solutions for the mass vaccination campaigns associated with COVID-19. And Errol is followed by Sanskriti Menon, who is a senior program director at the Center for Environmental Education in India. She's based in Pune and leads the CEE's work in central India. CEE was established in 1984 and works across India to develop innovative programs of work to build capacity and undertake demonstration projects in engineering, education, and sustainable development. So following the conversation with Toby, I'll then chair a short Q&A session some 15 to 20 minutes long, depending on the length of the discussion that we have. And this will be with all the speakers. So please do submit your questions via the Q&A function as we go along, and I'll look for those and be sure to consider them in the conversation. Promises to be a very timely and interesting, stimulating hour. So let's get started. Over to you, Filippo.
Thank you, Tim. I'm starting the presentation. Let me know when you can see my screen.
Yes, we can see that now. Thank you, Filippo.
Hello, everyone. Above all, it's about protecting us, protecting our families, our friends, protecting all humans against criminality. The healthcare business is attracting criminality. First of all, with falsified and counterfeited medical products, and trust me, they are more agile and swift than pharmaceutical industries. Look, just few weeks after launching the first COVID vaccination, Chinese authorities have already arrested more than 80 people making fake coronavirus vaccines with salted water. Falsified medical products may be 25 times more profitable than drugs like cocaine. Be aware, it's not the problem of developing countries. Our markets are also attracted. The big data and massive transactional flows generated by the pharmaceutical sector is a second pole of attraction for criminality. Again, the European Medicines Agency has been hacked by cyber criminals hunting valuable data on COVID-19 vaccines. It's a global scourge. In addition to physical anti-counterfeiting feature deployed by pharmaceutical industry, serialization is leveraging the integrity of data flows and as a deterrent to counterfeiter. It is about assigning a unique identifier to each unit of sales. This unique identifier composed of a product identification key, for example, a JTIN or global trade item number, and a unique serial number. They will be used at different points of the supply chain to trace and authenticate the genuinity of the products. With serialization, each pack is composed of a physical pack and a digital pack. They are twins. We must now ensure the continuity and the coherence of two supply chains, the supply chain of goods and the supply chain of data. It is much more difficult for counterfeiters to simultaneously input illicit products into both legitimate supply chains. Serialization is dramatically increasing the detectability of abnormal situations, including counterfeiting, but not only. This is really and very promising. It is so promising that governments want to go fast. There is an African adage saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. You can see in the two maps the fast evolution of the world. In fact, markets are developing their serialization solution alone in a non-coordinated manner. It is not only a question of market, it's also a question of powerful lobbies. Pharmaceutical industries not active in vaccines have no interest to complexify their supply chain because of the specificity of the cold chain or because of the complex and scattered dispensing model, which is not simply through pharmacists and other drugstores. Not sure the global solution is smart enough to take it into account. COVID pandemic has revealed this situation. Now, the world wants to go far, and as far as possible together. For the worldwide economy, each single market needs to get back in control of COVID pandemic. Look, Audi, the car maker, stopping production site in Europe because of shortage of electronic components in Asia due to COVID. The new challenges of the pharmaceutical sector will be to build a serialization and traceability with an increased level of standardization. In order to build the needed interoperability between systems, so a shortage of drugs in Europe could be supplied from the US stocks, still ensuring the supply chain of data. If those challenges seem and are quite big, behind that, there is a big opportunity. There are opportunities to fastly bring back the worldwide trades in a more stable state during situations like pandemic crisis. For pharmaceutical industries, this supply chain of data may revolutionize the healthcare business. The information generated by the serialization and traceability may be used, for example, to drive the inventories from sales, contrarily to today's situation, a dream for the finance of pharma industry. It may be used to enhance the supply chain visibility. To monitor the life cycle of vaccines in a specific market, look on the right of the screen here, Europe wants to leverage data to manage shortage of medicinal product in Europe. All these information influencing global strategies, driving investment in research and development, in packaging and logistics in order to increase their efficiency. The challenge behind the opportunities will be not to forget the primary objective of serialization, which is to increase the safety of healthcare sector by fighting criminality. I hope every time you will be connected with serialization and traceability, you will remind this primary objective of dispensing safe medicines. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Filippo. We're following a fascinating introduction to the area of serialization and data utilization. I'm going to ask Toby Peters to come in and give us his perspective on the topics of today's webinar, and then lead the roundtable conversation. Toby, over to you.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you for inviting me to be here. I just want to make a couple of quick points before moving to the panel discussion. I think that's going to be far more interesting. But just quickly, I think countries are starting to recognize the size of ambition of mass vaccination, from access to vaccines, the distribution from the airport to the arm, which often requires last mile outreach into remote locations, actually persuading people to have a vaccine, to tracking who's been vaccinated, and of course waste management, something which we are not talking about much today widely. And we've got to remember, in parallel, we've got to keep the existing services and vaccine programs operational. It's interesting, timelines are becoming more pragmatic. Bangladesh is now aiming to, I think, vaccinate 80% of the population, but within 2 years. And the government recognised it lacks the experience, the infrastructure, the manpower to accomplish the task. But they equally recognise there's no alternative but to complete this mass vaccination programme. And equally, I think governments are recognising that the infrastructure doesn't exist, and that the implementation of routine vaccination isn't fit for purpose. There's no security concerns to the same level, no campaign activities, or not many. And if you look at, say, Bangladesh, I mean, in the 64 districts, 26 don't have capacity to handle the Oxford vaccine, which has to be preserved at 2 to 8 degrees Celsius, according to analysis of their master plan. And if they want to use the Moderna vaccine at minus 15 to 20, the number jumps to 56 of the district. The current system in answering these questions is that systems for mass vaccination, rapid mass vaccination, don't exist. and we can't therefore investigate them. So what we're doing at Birmingham with Heriot Watt is using Bangladesh as a case study to create a modelling approach whereby we can test multiple scenarios for mass vaccination and help shape the strategies and resilience. While there is, of course, much discussion around fridges and freezers, as we've already heard, the success of any vaccination programme does rely heavily on data, using information from the point of use right the way through to the from the manufacturing to the point of use, and how we actually capture, manage the compliance, the registration, and ensure patient safety, as we've heard, through anti-counterfeiting measures. So without any further ado, I'd like to sort of jump straight in now to some discussion with our panel. And starting off, Sanskriti, with you, if I may. You've recently completed a fast-track study of COVID-19 immunisation in India. How different is this to traditional immunisation needs? And what do you see as the big challenges? Maybe you could sort of give us a couple of minutes of an overview.
Thanks, Toby. Yes, India does run one of the largest immunization programs in the world. So there is considerable experience over the last decade or so in building up different components of mass-scale immunization. But what's different here is really the sheer scale of vaccinations. And in the regular immunization program, we have close to about 160 million vaccinations per year, with a 28 million birth cohort and another 100 million children in the age groups of 1 to 5 and another 30 million pregnant women. But with COVID-19, even if you look at the more vulnerable population and frontline workers, we are still looking at another 300 million people to be vaccinated. So one big difference is really the sheer scale of the vaccination program to be undertaken over and above the regular immunization program that India does. And certainly, like you mentioned, in Bangladesh, the cold chain. Over the years, India has put in place a pretty good cold chain infrastructure, which at an aggregate level seems to be capable of storing the additional quantities of the COVID-19 vaccine required. But the ratios there is quite a range. And we have like one public healthcare center to about 30,000 population in some cases, in some states, to even about 200,000 people per PHC in some of the most densely populated states in the country. And that is certainly a kind of a challenge for certain states. And then electricity supply is erratic in a few states. And these also happen to be the more populous states. And power cuts go up to even 60 hours a week in some places. And so the fallback is, of course, diesel gensets. And so that is a challenge. And as you mentioned, the disturbance to the regular immunization schedule, that has certainly been observed, I mean, all of last year and even now. So these are some of the largest challenges, if I may say, Toby.
Thank you, Sanskriti. And moving on, Amy, in a nutshell, I mean, it's a very big topic, as we've already heard, but just sort of quickly, how can data help improve the supply chain for COVID-19 immunization? We've heard about the importance of for managing counterfeiting, but there's a lot of other things. So in a bird's eye view, how do you see the role of data?
So I think what we have to do, first of all, is take a very pragmatic approach in terms of the logistics, distribution and supply chains that are existing today. And what we see is there is, in a global distribution of any pharmaceutical product, but if we take the COVID vaccine as an example, a company will be using multiple logistics service providers. And we can also see with the types of vaccines, even COVID vaccines, that they come requiring different temperatures ranges. So what we have is then different types of packaging that's being used, maybe different types of IoT temperature loggers that are being used. And so when we look at the landscape of global distribution, we can see that there's many different stakeholders, many different partners, and many different types of packaging devices, data sources is what we see them as, that are out there. what we really need to do is to bring all of those data sources together to manage the risks. And Felipe gave a great example of anti-counterfeiting, making sure organized crime groups don't have a way-in for putting illicit products into the legal supply chain. But what we also have to do is make sure, particularly when there is vaccine inequality in the world, that the organized crime groups are going to be looking to target this type of product, that we don't allow any weak points within the supply chain for that to happen. So I think it's really about sort of making sure the supply chains have increased confidence, that we are continuity of supply, making sure there is that visibility and insights to products coming in as well, and that products remain safe and effective. And that's really what data and using it in a very coherent way can do.
And I suppose from what you're saying, Amy, they're also making sure it's joined up in a open source system where it works together rather than isolation. Errol, bringing you in, you're designing for mass vaccination centres in low and middle income countries. Why is there a gap in the delivery plans for COVID-19, or why is this a gap? And what are you doing to address this?
Right. If you sort of consider or look at ongoing universal immunization programs, they rely on a vast and permanent network of tiny little healthcare centers dotted around the country, served by an equally complex cold chain. And if you're contemplating mass vaccination, we should really sort of put the cold chain on its head and approach it in a different way. Rather than looking at a supply push cold chain, we should look at a demand pull cold chain where you use a more centralized approach. So we're talking about implementing mass vaccination centers that also serve as a hub for outreach teams. And by doing so, you now have a concept that does not interfere with ongoing universal immunization programs, firstly. Secondly, you have more and better accessibility for the urban population to get vaccinated fast. You have a much more streamlined supply chain by removing many of the hops that are currently found in traditional supply chains. And of course, by doing so, you also make it easier to enable down to -20-degree temperature support. And of course, by having mass vaccination centers, you create a much higher throughput in terms of vaccinations. And so what we do in our consortium is that we implement this kind of an architecture in a target country to complement the existing universal immunization program infrastructure without actually interfering with it. And our so-called vaccination as a service program would also rely on some innovations, including the ones that you have jointly created with, for example, the University of Birmingham, which is a virtual model that optimizes for the precise location and size of mass vaccinations in any given country.
Thank you, Errol. Coming back to you, Sanskriti, we've talked about mass vaccination, we talked about data, and you explained some of the challenges of India. But one thing I want to drill down on is obviously India, like many countries, relies very heavily on outreach. How do you see this as a specific challenge? And also, if I can ask sort of slightly a double question, how do you see the data tracking beyond the health center? Because obviously, you know, it's easier to track data to a health center, to that building, but once you go out, it has another level of challenges. So from your work, specifically, what did you come across challenges around outreach and data in outreach?
Yes, Toby, it's essentially that the primary health centers do maintain data for the population that they have, but this data is not really carried beyond the primary health center or the sub-center, and that is going to be an issue. Now, the government of India has launched the CoWIN app, which is supposed to register people and create the vaccination schedule and inform people when they have to turn up for the vaccination and where they have to go. Even though it's a limited population just now with healthcare workers and frontline workers, this has not really worked out fully foolproof. There have been glitches. And what we understand is that there is a next version to be launched soon. And there is also news that the app will be linked to voter IDs and the electoral rolls. But we see that from our own studies and those of other researchers with voter ID lists, that almost 30% of the population, especially in cities that show high in-migration, they are not already included in the voting list. So there are some partial databases, and the specific databases of people with elderly people and those with comorbidities, I don't think those lists do actually exist. So there is a big data challenge here for individuals. And what we understand from the healthcare facilities where the emergency use vaccination is currently going on is that it's a combination of the COVID app and the regular traditional methods of lining up and registering people physically. And going forward, it may be that the PHCs will in fact have to do door-to-door surveys, and it's because it's really too massive an exercise, and the vaccine rollout is already underway. And while the COVID app will continue perhaps to be upgraded, we will still have to do merged and blended sort of approach to getting the data of individuals recorded and registered, and especially making sure that people do take the double dose. It's also a bigger challenge in rural areas, and in urban areas with access to smartphones, it's still possible, but massively the penetration of smartphones in rural areas is quite limited, and so asking people to self-register on phones may be quite an issue. Yes.
So I think, yeah, you've identified this outreach, but also this data tracking is going to be a big problem. And India, as we know, has probably one of the most advanced immunization programs. It's certainly the largest. So when you look at other countries, big challenges there. Errol, if I can come back to you, then I'll come back to you, Amy. But Errol, just in contrast, how are you using data in the mass vaccination centres? How do you think potentially you can help overcome of some of the problems that Sanskriti has identified?
Well, we think technology is always useful, and we are aware of the constraints, especially in developing countries where not everyone is the owner of a smartphone. Nevertheless, I think you can improve the overall mass vaccination process by deploying technology. For example, you don't want a disorganized crowd showing up at a mass vaccination center. You really want to incentivize them to pre-register themselves and book an appointment. To the extent that is possible. For those who don't have smartphones or don't prefer to use a smartphone, then you put in place call centers as well, who act as the registrar on their behalf. And lastly, for the remaining segment of the population who will not call in or will not register online, for those, of course, you do create the ability to form queues outside of a mass vaccination center, for example, and vaccinate them that way. Nevertheless, when they do show up for a vaccination, those who have not yet been registered, you use technology to then create a health record. And that health record then is used throughout the remaining process of that vaccination via check-in to the actual vaccination registration, on to the observation period where you observe for AAV or adverse events following immunization events. And ultimately, you would like to issue them a digital health pass or print out a health pass for them that would allow them a certain degree of freedom of movement thereafter. So that's one area where technology, I think, is very, very useful in a mass vaccination campaign inside mass vaccination centers. Another area is in the cold chain. In order to assure quality of the vaccine, you really want to deploy a continuous temperature sensor from start to finish, ideally offline, because not everyone has access to telecommunications abilities everywhere. So an offline affordable sensor that tracks the temperature budget of any given batch of vaccines from the main depot all the way to the mass vaccination center and onwards to outreach. that can be checked visually very quickly to determine whether that vaccine is within the temperature budget or not. And lastly, you also want to track handovers of vaccines during the cold chain. So every time there's a handover, you want to be able to log precisely who handed over what batch to whom. We're very worried about theft, organized crime, as well as opportunistic crime. And one of the ways we can push back on that is to not open any gaps and make sure people understand that every handover is tracked and audited.
Great. Amy, that leads me on to really my next question, which is, obviously there's a lot of work you're doing and others, and we've heard about it for supporting COVID immunization. But one of the things which is very close to my heart is how we can use this program or this investment or this spend to become investment by delivering lasting legacy. So do you see that looking forward, there are ways that what we're solving for COVID will deliver lasting legacy, leapfrog us forward to new opportunities?
Yes, I think we're on the precipice of a huge opportunity to really make change in those lower and middle income countries. Having worked with pharmaceutical companies for the past 20 plus years, they have a responsibility to make sure that the patient receives product that's safe and effective. And to do so, as Errol just mentioned, they need to make sure that they're managing the supply chain. So in doing that, it's really important that we follow good distribution practice for medicinal products. And in the distribution part of it, what I see as potential benefit is really that education and training and investment in helping the supply chain, the transportation companies, the trucking companies in these countries actually understand how they can be more compliant. And some of those are really simple, pragmatic steps that they can take in order to become compliant with GDP. So it may be segregating an area of their warehouse with tape on the floor for pharmaceutical products, so there's no cross-contamination risk with other products such as perishables. If they are very experienced at moving foodstuff and they do have temperature control facilities, they must understand they have to be segregated, but they can still use those facilities and processes that they're using as long as the products are not mixed at all. They have two refrigerated areas, then they can use one of those as a dedicated cold store, and things like their trucks and vehicles, making sure they're clean, they have pest control records, and that their processes are written down. So there's a whole range of really practical things that hopefully this will improve the quality of the global cold chain, but certainly making it a little bit more equal around the world.
Thank you, Amy. I'm going to jump on to another sort of area of discussion, but before I do so, Tim, are there any burning questions or any questions you have coming in from around the data and the first answers we've been hearing about and discussing?
Yeah, thank you, Toby. So from my perspective, I've been very interested in this tension between the need to have secure data and ensure the integrity of that data, but also, in the scale up, the need to be pragmatic about handling the vast volumes of different product with different requirements, both in terms of distribution infrastructure in temperature environments, but also in terms of how you handle the packaging. So that tension between needing to maintain that data-driven integrity for security against the tension of needing to be sustainable in our treatment of waste. And I want to hear a little bit more on that as we go forward into the next session. And in terms of questions that we've been getting in, I think there's been some questions around serialization, and in particular, are there plans for countries to align their serialization so that surplus vaccines from one country can be given to patients in another? I think that's an interesting question, and we'd certainly be keen to hear some views on that.
Great. So we're moving to the question around waste. Am I on but Amy, do you want to just quickly come back on that question about servitization and global integration?
Yeah, of course. So I think what it's about is understanding what first of all, in terms of cybersecurity, that's a really important area. So we have to make sure that, any computerized systems are working to certain standards that are going to be receiving in the data. The next thing is the actual kind of physical security of products moving through. And when we talk about sort of data-driven intelligence and supply chains, it's really about looking at what's practical to extract from the supply chain. So it might be that we don't have the capabilities for an IoT device to transmit real-time data, but we may have cell coverage with a mobile phone where we can download an application and actually track the shipment moving through GPS location. It may be that neither of those are possible, but what we can do is tap into flight aware, and we can actually track shipments moving and capture those chain of custody points. So it's a very flexible future state in terms of data, because there's so many different data points, nodes and streams that we can tap into to really give an idea of the visibility. So it's not a one size fits all. And I think it's about making sure that they are all on platforms that are very safe and secure, because that data is very important. And the future really is merging together the serialization as well, because you can capture those codes within the supply chain to actually know where that particular batch is and where it was at any point. So if there are any quality issues, you can actually trace it back to understand where they happen to improve and develop continuous improvement from a quality point of view. So hopefully that answered that question.
Thank you, Amy. So I want to just pick up now on this point about the challenges of waste. It's something, we're talking about how do we design a vaccine, we've talked about how do we manufacture it historically, now we're talking about how do we move it, but equally, how do we manage the waste? And I've seen in my travels, in my work, I've seen processes as simple as just digging a pit, filling it up and setting fire to it as a management strategy for pharmaceutical waste, which isn't what we can see and isn't the right way to be doing it. But Sanskriti, picking up on your research, do you think the systems can cope with the massive uplift in COVID-19 vaccination waste, from the vials to the needles, the PPE equipment? And is sustainability being considered, or is it still just about getting people vaccinated as the priority?
No, so India's had biomedical waste management regulation since the late 1990s, and there has been extensive training for healthcare workers and health centers on keeping biomedical waste and other wastes generated in healthcare centers separate, and within the infectious categories also keeping the different waste segregated. But you're right that there has been quite a huge influx of biomedical waste with COVID. And so just to give some figures that the Central Pollution Control Board recently released as well. So the general annual production is about 200,000 tons, and there is an additional 33,000 tons of COVID-19 biomedical waste that has been produced in the last 7 months or so. And and a lot of it is PPE. And again, for the COVID-19 vaccination campaign, not new guidelines, or refresher set of guidelines has been issued about how the waste has to be managed. And I think training has also happened. But as we know, also, of course, our study was done a little earlier, not when the vaccination campaign has started, which is over the last month or so. Our study was done over the last year. And even then, we found that while there is segregation happening in the health centers, the lifting is not necessarily fully organized. And already, even prior to COVID, maybe about 10 to 15% of biomedical waste was not really getting treated properly. And you're right in seeing that, just open burning of infectious waste, or, deep burial is anyway a practice that is carried out. So deep burial is still something that happens in the PHCs, in the remote PHCs. But there is quite a lot of, and in the early months of lockdowns, when CE itself has been running a biomedical waste management plant in Gulbarga in southern India, and there was some initial confusion about are we to burn PPE, until it was clarified that you can use hypochlorite. But again, as I think Amy mentioned, that there is a lot of training to be done and repeat training to be done, as well as bolstering up the systems for collection, and then, of course, adding capacity at the common biomedical waste management treatment facilities. That is still an ongoing topic in India, still an ongoing process in India.
So as you say, there's still some challenges. Amy, jumping over to you, can data help with tracking waste and sustainability? If we know what's going out, does it make it easier to track how it's managed afterwards?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different types of packaging as well. Some have more of an impact environmentally than others. So I think when we take, again, that sort of company industry responsibilities, we know that with some of these low and middle income countries, things like reclamation of packaging, reusing and sending it back are not going to be practically possible. So I think that looking at maybe offsetting that with other supply chain flows where actually the reclamation of packaging and reusing certain components may be more practical is something to consider. But certainly from a data point of view, using the data to understand what's happening in the supply chain, making sure that we're not over-engineering solutions in terms of temperature management, and then that data being used for real-time preventative waste of the actual product. That's a really big risk, going through all of this in terms of the impact environmentally of moving something from A to B, but because it's not been handled correctly, that actually having an impact on the end consumer, the flow of the product going to the vaccination centres and the waste of the actual physical product is something we need to, and we actively can prevent happening. So I think that it is going to be a big challenge. I think there is going to be a lot of additional packaging around, but as we become more advanced in understanding, bringing the data together and actually looking at what's happening, where these flows are, where we can make quality improvements to prevent waste, I think that will have a beneficial impact on sustainability overall.
Thank you. And I assume, Errol, just jumping over to you quickly, that the benefit of a mass vaccination centre is that you should be able to manage waste more sustainably. But is that your thoughts would be very interesting?
Yes, indeed. I think there's a very interesting paper out of the Philippines from about 10 years ago where they analyzed medical waste disposal, and it turns out that logistics costs account for half of the cost of waste disposal. And if you actually look at the overall cost of waste disposal compared to the other costs involved in mass vaccination or in vaccination campaigns, it's actually not that high. And the amount of volume of medical waste also is not unmanageable. But here with a mass vaccination campaign approach or architecture, you have the opportunity to cut down on logistics and the need to move these medical waste long areas by disposing of medical waste at a mass vaccination center. Since it's already serving as a hub anyway for outreach, whatever waste comes back from outreach, as well as the waste that gets generated in a mass vaccination campaign, can be very easily disposed of locally right there by using, for example, clean methods such as autoclaving machines, sterilization machines that rely on electricity only. And of course, if you have proper segregation at source for the waste, that gets then shredded immediately and autoclaved in a machine, what comes out is clean treated waste that can be recycled as well. And in this way, you have a very convenient way and very cost-efficient way of dealing with medical waste.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to squeeze in one final question, if I may, to all three of you. We're now recognizing the challenge of mass immunization in low and middle income countries. And we recognize that this is an issue of equity, and we've got to address vaccine nationalism and get vaccines out quickly globally. But I want to go down one stage further. How do we deliver COVID-19 vaccination to conflict zones, refugee camps and displaced people? Smriti, you talked about even the problem in India of knowing where people are because of movement. But to me, I think this is another area where we've got to really start thinking about. So Amy, any thoughts on COVID-19 vaccination and conflict zones, refugee camps?
Yeah, so it actually shocked me to find out that 1 in 97 people globally are displaced. So that's 80 million people globally as of last year, June 2020, are actually displaced. So I think that it really highlighted to me that there is a global issue out there. We have at the moment a global pandemic, and that actually does require a global and very cohesive and collaborative response from the industry. So in terms of the solutions for that, I think it's really has to be forced at a government level, but certainly raising public awareness and working on education and partnerships is a key part of that. So hopefully that will be something that the more we talk about these, particularly in industry groups as well, and the more recognition, there will be more impetus to actually push forward and to look at how we can make this global problem a global solution.
Thank you. So the first thing we need to do is actually get it on the agenda. Coming back to you, Errol, any quick comments on this issue? You're looking at mass vaccination in low middle income countries, but what about refugee camps, displaced?
Yeah. Good question. I think there are plenty of very good technologies there that can be deployed in vaccinating refugees or displaced people or people living in conflict zones, such as drone technology, satellite communications, off-grid cooling equipment, biometric identification technology. All of these are available and can be deployed. I think the biggest question really is, first of all, who pays for it and who executes? Now, I understand Gavi has put aside about 5% of the COVAX facility for displaced people and refugees and people living in conflict zones. So that would contribute a fair amount towards supplying the vaccine. But then really the biggest problem is who will execute vaccinations. I think refugees and displaced people are more straightforward. You have better access to them, it's less dangerous, and you could deploy a mass vaccination architecture similar to the one we're offering. But conflict zones is an entirely different proposition, and I don't see any other way of getting the United Nations troops involved on humanitarian missions there.
Thank you. And Sanskriti, anything from your work which sort of touched on this issue?
Not really, Toby. And I think within India, there are of course conflict zones within India, but we also have a very large migrant population, which during the early months of lockdown, we saw like mass exodus. And I think for us, handling the data related to migrants itself is quite a large challenge. But I'm sorry, I really don't have much to offer on the refugee and conflict zone.
No, but as you said, this data is going to be critical. NGOs, I imagine, will be very important in the delivery mechanism. But Tim, back to you.
Thanks very much, Toby. And certainly thank you for that really stimulating and interesting point towards the end there. And that really feeds in, I think, to some of the questions we've been getting in. And some questions I have in my own mind around how we transfer the learning that we're currently experiencing in various countries around the world as vaccination programs get underway, how we successfully collaborate to transfer that learning from one part of the world to another, and how we indeed take that learning forward to deal with things like conflict zones and refugee camps and similar. And part of that comes back to my question from the audience member earlier around the plans to align. Their question was very specifically about serialization, but the plans to align processes and approaches to enable surplus vaccines to be taken from one country and then given to patients in another. So I guess really an initial question to all of the panelists from the audience that in terms of how does this learning get transferred? What are we really doing about that to make sure that we're capturing all of that, transferring it? Would you like to come in first on that, Sanskriti, in terms of how your learning is being captured and what vehicles there are for transferring that learning?
Sorry, with CEE and with the University of Birmingham, with Toby, we've been actually looking at community cooling hubs, and our earlier work is in fact related to taking cooling facilities closer to the rural communities. And so the COVID vaccination experience and the need for energy, bringing sustainable energy and reliable energy and cooling services closer to the community with a combination of really multifunctional hubs. I think that's what we are looking at as a learning to take forward in the rural cooling sector.
Okay, and would you like to say a few words on that as well, Errol? I think there's clearly going to be a huge amount of learning in what you're doing, and how is your thinking, your advanced thinking around how you transfer that learning through collaboration?
Well, I think if a country, obviously all countries that have a lack of vaccine would like to take on more vaccines to vaccinate their population, would love to be able to take on surplus vaccines from a third country. The big problem is going to be trust. How does the receiving country know that the vaccine it receives from another country is good to use? Unless there's verifiable proof of that batch of vaccines that it is still within the allowed temperature budget. So serialization is a very necessary and a good thing, but the other problem really is how do you implement a way where one country can prove to another that this batch of vaccines is good to use? And so I think it becomes extremely important that any country that receives a batch of vaccines immediately uses temperature monitoring equipment on every single batch, so that this transfer to a third country can be made possible in a later stage.
Okay. Thank you. That's a really useful answer to one of the questions there from the audience, and I'm keen to hear, Amy, your perspective on how we transfer learning in a collaborative way from the experience we've had in the last few months and we'll be having in the next few months. What mechanisms and relationships are there to enable us to do that?
Well, I think just following on from Errol's point there, the audit trail, having a complete end-to-end audit trail and understanding the product has been and maintained effective throughout the supply chain is really critical. I think that, in terms of sharing data within the industry, we're pretty good in terms of time and temperature sensitive shipments, which is what vaccines fall under for us, in terms of intelligence sharing, risk sharing, understanding where organized crime groups are operating. And we are sharing in between industry that information all the time. I think external of that, being on webinars, talking on interviews, the press have been very interested in this subject, and that in part gives consumer confidence that actually as an industry, we've got this, we know how to move these types of products around the world, is really important. But I think in terms of sustainability and some of those particular challenges, I do think having a mechanism for sharing learnings and case studies with on a global basis so that we can look to continuously improve the industry is definitely something we should be all spending a bit of our time working on.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. Because I mean, clearly it's very tempting to in this kind of situation to push forward very strongly and with the great amount of effort on actually solving the problem, and then missing and losing a lot of the learning along the way. And clearly, with the number of countries that haven't even begun to undertake vaccination programs yet, there is a significant danger that learning will end up in silos and not be transferred. I mean, Toby, you're a leading global expert on these issues, and where do you see the appropriate forum and place for this transfer? How do you see it taking place?
Well, I think that there are two things just quickly. One is obviously we're seeing now some really good global collaboration initiatives, the Cool Coalition, Sustainable Energy for All, KSET, where they're wholly designed to bring together the communities to share knowledge and learning. But also, from our perspective, what we're doing, this is why we're building this first of a kind cold chain model for low and middle income countries built on COVID-19, because obviously that gives you the ability to input the learning, input the knowledge, and then use it to drive better design and better solutions for different markets and countries. So I think those, I think there are going to be, also there'll be a lot of academic papers and reports, but I think it's about collaboration and using the initiatives to do that, to make it happen, and also programs such as our virtual model, where you can really test and trial and see what would be the impact of learning in one country on the cold chain solution in another, very quickly and efficiently.
Yeah, thank you for that, Toby. And it's really good that you and others are becoming advanced in your thinking about that, because there's a real danger there of us losing so much knowledge, as it's human nature that as certain countries complete their first wave of vaccination programs, that there'll be a sort of a collective sigh of relief, and knowledge, the impetus for getting the knowledge transferred will take very much a second place. So that's quite a concern. And thinking really a bit more about that long haul issue, there is of course the very real possibility that there may need to be put in place annual booster programs and various ad hoc programs to deal with mutants and variations of the vaccine. The impact of this on the sort of the cold supply chain and how that infrastructure is used going forward, particularly in relation to the data that is assembled. What do the panel think of the sort of the prospects for long-term sustained immunization programs? What are we thinking about that at this stage? Maybe Amy, I could turn to you first on that, please.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a really great blueprint for how we can move forward if this is a global problem. We need a global solution, and then we need globally us to be connected, leveraging those technologies, the learnings, the best practices, and to move forward, but also to be very reflective on what has happened. Out of this, there will be mistakes that are made. There will be things that we can have done better within the supply chain logistics, the distribution, and then the administration of the vaccine. But looking to kind of continuously reflect and improve on that as we go forward is really necessary. This probably won't be the last virus that we come across. Certainly localized in countries, the Ebola pandemic, the issue that they had in parts of Africa in recent years as well. So I think that, maybe also looking back at how smaller groups of the population have actually dealt with some of these things, and see whether we can leverage from their learnings as well. And then going forward for that sort of developing of this into something that becomes the blueprint of what we can do better, so that we are more prepared next time.
Yeah, thank you for that, Amy. And I think within that blueprint, we really do need to have really thought very carefully about this waste management issue, because in terms of creating waste management infrastructure and approaches that have a circular economy type model at their core, it is going to be really essential in creating a sustainable future for this continuous drumbeat of vaccination distribution into the future. And Sanskriti, I know the challenges of scale up in India are such that I'd be very keen to understand your perspective on the need to continuously be revisiting this vaccination program, and what the legacy infrastructure will do to help us do that, and how can we keep that sustained effort up, and how can we keep all the players engaged?
Yeah, I think some of the things sort of come up in this webinar too. I think they've been giving me quite a lot of what shall I say, room for thinking. And it's also that, and something that Amy just said, of learning from quite a range of situations. And for example, in India, we do have like hugely populous and hugely dense states and regions, and we also have really remote and sparse populations. And there's quite a range of experience, and just learning from the different healthcare professionals and the community of practice that needs to sort of emerge and be connected to draw and remember the lessons from this experience. I think that is quite important. And also, I think there's been quite a lot of discussion over the last few months, and a range of innovations. Not all the innovations have been brought into practice, but I think quite a lot of thinking and quite a lot of generation of options has perhaps happened in the last few months. And again, not losing just because they didn't go to scale. Just like, for example, in the development of the vaccine, there are so many candidates, and not all the candidates will become viable and go to market, so to say. But there is such a jump in innovation and thinking around so many different aspects. I mean, it's a cold chain, it's the flexible cold chain, it's the adaptable multifunctional cold chain, or it's the staff training, it's waste management, it's the data. And I think the need to be good on all of these, I think that's really become so clear now. And to be able to document this and bring this into the discussions in healthcare, and not only in healthcare, in other sectors as well. I think that's going to be quite important, and a lot of reflection is documentation and reflection is certainly needed as we go forward. Thank you.
Okay, well, look, thank you for that, Sanskriti. That's a great point on which to close today's webinar. I'd like to thank all of the contributors for this stimulating and really thought-provoking discussion. It's really been a superb event, and I'd like to thank Claire Edwards, the chair of the Pharmaceutical Committee of the Process Industries Division of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, for organizing and making this happen. I really look forward to the third one in the series. A recording of this event will be emailed directly to all those who registered for the event in a few days' time. And then the event itself will be, the recording will be placed on the IMechE's webinar hub. So I encourage you to make that, make your colleagues that have not been able to join us today aware of that. I think it's going to be a very long haul. It's a long journey. There's a lot for us to address, and I'm sure that we can look forward to the next in this series of webinars. Thank you very much for joining us, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Thank you.